Hello everybody and welcome back to another Wainriders preview video, and in fact our final video looking at the factions with regard to the units that they will be able to train. We have, it's been over a year of bringing out releases faction by faction for the new mod Wainriders for Rome Total War Alexander, and we've come at last to the end. We're going out with a bang today, looking at Great Rune, which is in a lot of ways the big bad of this mod. So let's take a look at this. It's a lovely day for a battle. We've got a nice open field here, good terrain for chariots and cavalry. So we will take a look at a custom battle of all that Great Rune has to offer. Now, before we get into it, there are a couple of caveats. Of course, this mod is a work in progress, and although I think the units are basically done, there may be some changes to remain with regard to their availability, exactly which units will be available where, and so on. So as I go through this, don't necessarily take my word as the actual gospel with regard to where and when these units will be available. We'll just go through these unit by unit here. Now, in some ways, Great Rune shares a lot of units with a faction we've seen earlier. If you go back to one of the first Wainrider preview videos, I think, looked at the Western Horde. And so, of course, they're both Wainrider factions, but we've decided to go for a more opulent, more sort of settled, civilized look for the Great Rune faction. This is going to be situated more in the east. If you're familiar with 4th Age Total War, it's going to be basically have its homeland roughly around the area of the chiefdom of Rune, which sort of makes sense. And this is, in a lot of ways, the big faction that got everything going. We hear a little bit in the lore about the Eastern Wainriders, which is a word Tolkien uses, I believe, in Unfinished Tales, to describe this offshoot, this group of the Wainriders, making war with the people of Khand to the south. And in the last large battle of the Wainriders with Gondor, it is said that on that battlefield there were a lot more cavalry than the men of Gondor anticipated. So we sort of took that as a cue, because you have mentions in the lore not only of these Eastern Wainriders, but also the Wainriders of Rhovanion, and Tolkien seems to refer to them as sort of being slightly different groups. So the Wainriders of Rhovanion would be the Western Horde. The Eastern Wainriders would be this Great Rune faction. And because of the presence of cavalry there, we've sort of gone with a more cavalry-based faction, but also with a lot more chariots. Now, historically speaking, this faction presents something of a challenge, because as you may know, through history, the progression is generally chariots are used in warfare, and then cavalry. And once cavalry really catches on, the chariots are phased out because chariots have a lot of sort of logistical problems and efficiency problems compared to cavalry. So sort of justifying having a large cav presence and a large chariot presence was a little bit difficult for me anyway to sort of wrap my head around. What we ultimately went with, and we're looking at here today, is the bodyguard unit for Great Rune. This is your Wainrider nobles, and we assumed that these Eastern Wainriders are going to be a little more of the old-fashioned, right? So they're going to sort of stick more to the old prestige of those chariot warriors, whereas the Western Horde are, to some extent, the poorer guys, the freebooters who are more out for just efficiency's sake. They want to roll into new territory and take over, and however they do that, they'll go with it. So the bodyguard for the Western Horde is more cavalry, and you see they have a little more reliance on cavalry, you could argue, than chariots. Great Rune, on the other hand, has a lot of chariots, but also the potential to get some really nice cavalry as well. So one challenge with a chariot-heavy faction, of course, using the Rome Total War engine, is balance. And as I mentioned several points through these videos, balance is something that we will continue to work on through development of the mod to make sure that these chariots are really going to be the sort of the proper kind of threat. For this bodyguard unit, we've gone with archers. So these are the big wains, as you can see, very nice looking with a sort of opulent gold and bronze worked into the chariots themselves. Nice splashes of color here as well. And again, they're archers, so this is going to encourage the AI to keep them out of battle. and I think that will help to some extent. You can certainly play it in such a way, if you're fighting these guys, that you'll have a lot of tools to deal with the enemy chariots. Most likely long-range foot troops will be very effective against them, I would imagine. But we're probably going to beef them up to give them a lot of, a lot of defense, armor, that type of thing, to try to mitigate the option of you just shooting them down at a distance. So that's one chariot unit. This is the bodyguard unit. So we'll see how this performs. In terms of other stuff, let's get the infantry out of the way first, I would say, because a lot of that is going to be somewhat similar to what we've seen. One difference, though, from the Western Horde is going to be these guys, chosen infantry. So these will have bows as well as spears, and they're really modeled after the chosen cavalry. Let me find some of them. I think they're down here. Yeah, right here, chosen cavalry. So this unit is very similar to the Western Horde's bodyguard, but it's not a bodyguard unit for the Great Rune. It is instead sort of like the top tier of cavalry. And so the sort of narrative reason for that, I guess, is that, again, we imagined the Western Horde to be more of the junior partner in the Wainrider factions, and so it would have represent a lot of sort of lesser nobles going off into the west to seek plunder and adventure. And so these lesser guys would have led their own bodyguards with their own sort of lower tier units, and they would have become the faction leaders, essentially the royal family of the Western Horde. But if you're playing Great Rune, you'll still get to use them, and so and they'll make an appearance there. But in addition, you'll have their infantry counterparts, these chosen infantry. So very strong foot archers with spears to make them a sort of an interesting threat on the battlefield. Very similar in some ways to, the Persian Immortals, I guess. And so we did draw some inspiration from a few different sources for this faction. One of the things, if we could go back to the bodyguard unit for just a little moment, because I love the look of these guys. One of the difficulties with sort of determining the direction for this mod, for me, came down to imagining, how are we going to set up the Wainriders, because they're described as using chariots. And again, that's totally unique in Middle-earth. No other peoples are ever described as using them. And so how do you picture them? Are they like Egyptian chariots, Assyrian chariots? Are they, the sort of earlier Central Asian stuff? Are we talking, Chinese chariots? So there was a lot of different ways we could have gone. Ultimately, overall for the mod, we chose sort of late antiquity in the West as sort of our, I guess, starting point. But I love that there are these really strong Assyrian vibes, especially with the horned helmets and the bronze and all of that kind of stuff. And the beards. I mean, the beards are just really respectable. So anyway, we've got a few influences there, not only from the sort of the Persian side, but also from this older kind of Bronze Age side. So that's one infantry unit. Let's take a look at some other stuff. In the front line, we have some Easterling warriors. These are bow and axemen, and so a pretty reasonable unit to sort of go into a melee fight as well as standing off at range. And we have swordwives. I can't remember if these units were previewed in the Western Horde video, but the idea is that they would be available to that faction as well. There's certainly references to young women being trained in war, and so I believe we're still working out exactly where and when the swordwives will be available, whether it's through some kind of specialization building or something along those lines. I can't quite remember how that's going to work. But the idea is that these are not necessarily going to be part of your main military tradition. They will be something that you have the option of training. Kind of a last resort type of unit, I suppose. Not terribly well armed compared to the others, but a potentially nice to have. Over here, we have Wainrider chieftains, javelins, and axes. This is a unit that the Western Horde also gets, so not a lot to say there. And then we've got some Easterling warband. This is your absolutely bottom tier stuff, but spear carriers needing to fill out numbers, garrison duty, and so on. And then we have some step axes, which are going to provide some tier 2 offensive power. And then over here, we have Iron Tower warriors. Now, you may remember these guys from the preview video on Khand. And indeed, we see some kinship between Great Rune and the chiefdom of Khand. They certainly had some conflicts, as described in the lore, but they seem to also have concluded those conflicts with an alliance. We certainly have a strong implication that Khandian cavalry was present in the last battle between Gondor and the Wainriders. And so we've imagined that there's a potential that that Great Rune could train these units. And it's not that these are specific to Khand, it's that both Khand and Great Rune sort of have this potential Sauron influence in these units with the very heavy armor, the very sort of menacing helms, and so on. A corollary unit to this is, let's see, right here, Iron Tower Cavalry. So you can see the similar armor style, the very heavily armed men as well as horses, but with spears here. And I love the design of the shield. We've got a tower. We've got flame on top of it. This is, again, directly from some references. I can't remember if this is in the Silmarillion or in the appendices, or maybe elsewhere, where it is said that Sauron had a dwelling in the east, and he surrounded his abode with fire, and men there worshipped him as a god. And so we imagine that something like this would have happened for the Easterlings of either sort of Wainrider allegiance or even the men of Khand. So this is one route you can go. I believe this is going to be more of a Sauron-specific unit, but I can't quite remember exactly how we have that set up. Other cavalry are going to be your steppe lancers. Again, these are going to be your lower tier units, as you can imagine, but very effective in large numbers as they are here. And then another cav unit would be the Easterling Horse Archers, which is also a unit available to the Western Horde. So a lot of commonalities. One unit that we haven't seen before is Settler Wains. So this is a new chariot unit. You'll notice it does not have the spikes and blades on the chariot, but it still does that fear effect. This is arguably not intended as sort of an offensive chariot unit, but it does have some functionality. It's basically the women who are inside the wain. You can see they're sort of on these different levels there, which I really like. It's sort of like benches set up on the wains. If you've played the 4th Age, The New Shadow, you may remember a mechanic there where you could, as different factions, train settler-type units. You could train 9 of them, up to 9 of them in a single turn, and they had relatively low cost, but their entire purpose was so that you could move population from one city to another. So you'd train them up in a settlement with a lot of population, send them out across the map to a city with low population, disband them there, and then they would go to build up the population so you could upgrade the city further. Ultimately, that mechanic was not carried forward in 4th Age Dominion of Men, and it won't be in Wainriders either. But I always liked the idea of having these essentially sort of civilian types moving around the map. And of course, you can certainly do population disbanding. We're not going to disable that feature. But here we have a unit that is essentially representing more of the civilian type. So these are bow women on wains, essentially. Let's see. I think we've now covered all of the infantry, and we just have a couple of chariot units to cover at this point, and then we can get sort of into the battle here. So here we've got Easterling chariots. I love the flag sort of on the back here, and they've got the spiked chariots, but very light. You can see that they're armed with these long axes, and the idea is that these are your almost kamikaze chariot units. You're going to rush them into the enemy, maybe giving them march orders to go right through the back of the enemy to just carve a big hole, follow up with other chariots or cavalry or infantry even, and then sort of swing around and do the same thing again. Kind of like how you would use scythed chariots in the vanilla game. So you're not going to leave a lot of your chariots just sitting around in melee because it's going to be easy for them to get hacked up in that scenario. But so you've got basically chariots at just about every tier for Great Rune. You've got these guys, and then you've also got war wains, which are a little more familiar to players of 4th Age Total War, but here they're looking a lot more opulent, right? Got a lot more decoration for the horses, for the wains themselves, and for the riders, for a very striking look. So you've got your melee wains with the Easterling chariots, but with the war wains, you've got javelins. So this is going to be certainly a powerful unit in terms of its charge, but also a unit that can do a lot of damage at range thanks to those javelins. And then, of course, your bodyguard types are going to command the even longer range Wainrider nobles chariots with their compound bows. And I also love the detail of those the short swords or the long daggers on the belts of these guys. So much to love. Okay, so let's start the battle here. And so I'm going to start by moving my cavalry out. A typical challenge with a chariot army is what to do with your chariots, how to use them with your cav and with your infantry, because the chariots are going to need a lot of space to maneuver, and they're going to need some open paths to do the most damage. And we've also got horse archers of various stripes and charging cavalry of various stripes. And we've got units that can use ranged as well as melee and do war cry and things. So there's actually a lot to micromanage if you're playing Great Rune, so it could get a little overwhelming. So what I'm trying to do is keep it simple by getting my horse archers out on either side with the idea that they can sort of skirmish away. And the horses, just the armor on these horses just looks amazing for the chosen cavalry. And then we're going to do some charging at targeted units. And then over here, we've already begun a charge with our chariots into the elite cavalry that Gondor has brought. We're bringing both our Wains as well as the Easterling chariots here to cut down these princes of Rhovanion. And they're routing already. Just a beautiful slaughter. And we're going to pull through and then away because we don't want to get caught by the infantry. Our War Wains are going to be shooting javelins behind them at the pursuing spearmen. We're going to try to stay out of the range there, pull them up the hill towards our other units, and then surround and charge down in. We've done something similar. We brought our other chariots away from the militia, and our horse archers around the back have started to see some success. Meanwhile, we've got the main army charging into our front line, where we're going to be charging in with our own cavalry to address that, as well as our infantry. Iron Tower Warriors going to smash into those Spearmen of Gondor, and they're going to be broken because we've got a fear effect on a lot of these units. Over here, we're going to be dealing with Guards of the Citadel. They're going to charge into our chariots. We're going to countercharge and get them to rout. This is played on hard difficulty, so that's the baseline, I imagine, for how the battles in the campaign are going to be fought. But you can see we struggle against the Knights of Gondor here. So this is the bodyguard unit for Gondor. They're not going to break that quickly, especially against these low-tier infantry that we've got. So we just need to pin them in place and do some repeated charges with our Wainrider nobles. Now, the nobles, again, I sort of wanted to throw them in just as a prestige thing, but you probably wouldn't really want to do this because your nobles have bows and they've got a pretty decent range. So you only want to charge them in when it's like the decisive blow. What do we have here? Some longbowmen facing our chosen cavalry who have now taken out their spears. We're going to get caught by some Gondor militia, but we're bringing in the steppe lancers. That's going to be a decisive charge to rout those longbowmen, and we're just going to keep pushing through. These Gondor militia have gone from shaken to wavering. We're bringing the Wains down to pressure them even more. Meanwhile, the rest of the battlefield is looking pretty open. The militia are routing. We've got our Easterling chariots here chasing down the bowmen of Gondor, and we're going to push on through, I think, into those river wardens, as well as these other units. It's basically men-at-arms and Gondor militia. The men-at-arms are a very solid unit, but here they're isolated from the rest of their army. We're going to be charging in the back, and so they're routing as a result of all of this punishment from all these different quarters.
Now hunt them down.
And so I think that's everybody on the battlefield. We're just chasing down the enemy king here. And just as in lore, in that last battle, we did kill... Was it Narmakil II or Kelamatar? I can't quite remember. There were a couple of kings of Gondor who were definitely killed by the Wainriders. So we're just chasing down the rest of those units. But so this is the faction, Great Rune. I am so looking forward to playing these guys. So you'll start with, a pretty substantial amount of territory in the east. You'll be up against the border to your east. You'll have some factions to your south, north, and west potentially to worry about, although you will have an alliance initially with the Western Horde. However, that alliance is, I believe it's not going to be in stone. It's not going to be as strong as some of the other alliances. So there's a potential there that you may end up fighting your own Wainrider allies, which sort of makes sense. So I hope you enjoyed this look at Great Rune. I am really looking forward to playing them. And this is not the end of the previews. We are going to be doing some more work. One of the things that I'm really looking forward to showing you is the actual campaign map, which looks absolutely beautiful, but we do have a few things to sort of finish up in terms of settlement placement and names and things like that. So I'd love to do a sort of a follow-up to this where we look at the situation of these factions on the campaign map and just sort of show you, here's where these factions are going to start. Here's some potential strategies, some things they need to worry about to sort of give you a sense of how that may play out on a larger strategic scale. So stay tuned for that, for any other updates. And until the next video, take care.